Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a look at one of the most interesting monitors to come out this year, the Gigabyte M28U. It's not a flagship monitor with thousands of local dimming zones for HDR, it's not an ultra cheap 1440p display for everyday gamers, but it does finally promise to do something I've been waiting for: lower the entry price for high refresh rate 4K displays. The M28U is a 28-inch 4K IPS display with a maximum refresh rate of 144Hz with all the usual variable refresh rate features. It's not the first 4K 144Hz monitor on the market, we've had those for some time now, but it is the first to offer these specifications at a price tag of just $600 US. Well, nearly the first. There was a Viotech monitor that hit this price point, but it's probably best we forget about that one. Hitting a $600 price point obviously isn't going to tempt people that only want to spend half of that on a monitor, which is a fair chunk of monitor buyers, but it does present significant price movement as 4K displays are now encroaching on the territory of higher end 1440p 144Hz class monitors. The LG 27GN950, for example, was a super popular monitor when it first launched, but it cost $800. So the M28U represents a huge $200 price reduction for what Gigabyte are promising is similar performance on paper. Another key selling point to the M28U is its inclusion of HDMI 2.1, which has been long awaited in this class of monitor. Sitting alongside DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC on the rear, HDMI 2.1 allows the M28U to be hooked up to a current generation console and get the full benefits of 4K 120Hz gaming. This is a big deal as it significantly adds to the versatility of this monitor for gamers, as you can hook up a PC and two HDMI 2.1 consoles and enjoy full spec gaming, no more annoying 60Hz limitation through HDMI. The general design Gigabyte are using here is similar to their other non-Aorus monitors in that it's quite a basic but functional construction built mostly out of black plastic. On the rear there's a glossy section and some matte sections of different textures, but there's no money being wasted on RGB LED lighting or crazy patterns. Overall, I think the monitor looks quite good, to be honest, and without any colourful highlights, it should fit with most gaming setups. The stand is somewhat ergonomic with support for height and tilt adjustment, however there's no swiveling or pivoting, so those looking for a portrait orientation will need to VESA mount it. Other than that though, it's a sturdy build with a decent range of height adjustment, and while the stand legs are a little large, they seem to work well enough. The on-screen display is controllable through a directional toggle on the rear of the monitor, and it comes with all the features we've come to expect from Gigabyte monitors with the exception of active noise cancellation. The KVM switch is included here, which is great to see, although for some reason the Gigabyte website say this is the world's first KVM gaming monitor, which clearly isn't true as the Gigabyte M27U included this feature and it came out last year. That said, the KVM is particularly useful here as you could hook up 3 PCs, all 4K 144Hz, and control them through a single keyboard and mouse. Without any further delay, let's get into the response time testing, and Gigabyte are providing 4 overdrive settings plus a smart OD feature. The first setting, off, still appears to be applying some level of overdrive as there is a small amount of overshoot present for some transitions. This isn't a big deal though, as inverse ghosting isn't that noticeable in practice, though ideally the off mode would be fully free of any overshoot artifacts. Outside of that, performance is excellent already with a 4.42 millisecond gray to gray average, which leads to cumulative deviation in the low 400 range, which is a great result from an IPS panel. With only higher overdrive modes to go, we're already getting 96% refresh rate compliance, so this is obviously a true 144Hz monitor, and it achieves that with little effort. The picture quality mode is marginally faster than off. The response time average is 0.3 milliseconds faster, cumulative deviation is basically the same, and the inverse ghosting rate has increased by a couple of percent. This is one of the smallest differences between overdrive modes I've seen, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The balance mode is another marginal improvement to response times. In fact, the difference is even smaller here compared to picture quality. In practice, both of these modes look virtually identical, and that's illustrated by no significant change to cumulative deviation results. The speed mode is where we see a noticeable change. Response times have improved by almost 1 millisecond on average, but this has introduced significantly higher overshoot and therefore noticeable inverse ghosting in all instances. Cumulative deviation has increased to over 500, so the balance between fast response times and overshoot is clearly not in favor of this mode, and I wouldn't recommend that anyone use it. Not to worry though, because we have 3 other modes to choose from, so to save you some time, which of these modes is best to use? Well, all 3 provide a single overdrive mode experience for the most part, although to keep overshoot at the absolute lowest, I would recommend using the off mode for adaptive sync gaming. You're still getting excellent response times at the high end of the refresh range, just 0.5 milliseconds slower than the bounce mode, but at lower refresh rates like 60Hz, we're shaving a couple of % off the average error rate. The 3 modes are so close that you could choose really any of them and still get a great experience. The only criticism I have here is slightly too much overshoot at 60Hz and inverse ghosting rate of 34%, even with the lowest overdrive setting, is somewhat visible in motion tests, but it's not going to impact your gaming experience significantly, so I'd still class this as a single overdrive mode monitor. On that basis, I'd just set and forget the off mode, which is the default mode, and not bother with the Smart OD feature, which can incorrectly choose to use the speed mode at some refresh rates like 100Hz, which is why I don't really recommend it. When compared to other monitors at the maximum 144Hz refresh rate, the M28U is a significant improvement on past 4K high refresh rate panels, especially around this price point. We're seeing outstanding results here with response time performance nearly 60% faster than the LG 27G950, though that does come with higher overshoot. Still, performance is around the mark of the best IPS monitors on the market today, stuff like the PG279QM and LG 27G-P850, though not as good as the Odyssey G7. Average performance across the refresh range is pretty good. The inverse ghosting rate is higher than I'd like to see, even though we are using the off mode here, but the response time average is very strong, similar to the 27G-P850 and better than the 27G-N950. So it's one of the fastest 4K monitors that I've tested for variable refresh rate gaming, outside of OLEDs of course. Cumulative deviation gives us an idea of how that bounce between response times and overshoot plays out in comparison to other monitors, and here the M28U is right in the middle of the IPS pack. It's not the outright fastest, but you can't complain about a low 500s result, especially as it's slightly better than the LG 27G-N950, about 5% better, and ahead of older products like the Acer Predator X27. Needless to say, despite bringing the price point of 4K 144Hz monitors lower than ever, the M28U is not sacrificing motion performance to get there. Dark level performance is a non-issue with the M28U, in fact it has excellent dark level performance that's ahead of other IPS panels, though today even the best VA monitors that you might be considering in this high-end price tier also don't really suffer from this issue. 120Hz performance is obviously quite important for the latest consoles that can make use of this refresh rate. Here the M28U is ahead of the other 4K displays in this chart, and inverse ghosting levels are manageable. Impressively, performance is quite a bit better than the new PG32U QX, which is a $3,000 HDR monitor, and while the M28U doesn't really provide meaningful HDR performance, this cheaper display is clearer in motion. 60Hz response time performance is pretty good, though like I was talking about earlier, overshoot levels are somewhat higher than I'd like to see. But nevertheless, this panel delivers a good 60Hz experience and you don't need to modify the overdrive setting to achieve it. Input lag is great with a processing delay of below 0.5 milliseconds. There's no issues here whatsoever with input lag, although I should note that I only tested the DisplayPort connector here as that is our standard method for testing. The only realistic way the M28U could provide better input lag is to increase the refresh rate, which reduces the delay between one frame and the next. The M28U is on the higher side for power consumption, consuming 46 watts when calibrated. It's marginally larger than 27-inch panels here, but does consume around 15% more power than a monitor like the LG 27G-N950, so it's not the most efficient 4K panel implementation, not that I think this will impact too many people. Backlight strobing is supported here through Gigabyte's AIM stabilizer sync technology, allowing for strobing and variable refresh rates at the same time, with supported refresh rates between 100 and 144 Hz. Like prior Gigabyte monitors, this is one of the better strobing plus VRR implementations that I've seen, with not nearly as much strobe crosstalk as similar models from other brands. However, I did notice some minor differences between the VRR and non-VRR modes with backlight strobing enabled. As is the case on a lot of monitors, the level of strobe crosstalk isn't uniform across the display, it varies from top to bottom, so typically there's a more pronounced double image on the upper and lower areas, but less in the middle. That's true with the non-VRR implementation. The middle of the screen had only a faint double image and a bit of red fringing, probably a typical slow red phosphor issue from the backlight used here, so it did for the most part improve clarity versus not using backlight strobing. Unfortunately, when strobing and adaptive sync were enabled at the same time, the area which delivered the clearest results moved from the center of the display to the lower third, so visual artifacts increased in the most important part of the screen. This is a trade-off to get strobing working alongside variable refresh rates, but it's not perfect tuning and may impact the experience for some people. I'd experiment with aim stabilizer sync enabled at the very least to see if you like the clarity that it provides. Let's take a look at color performance, starting with gamut coverage, which is on the low side, though not too dissimilar to modern VA panels for gaming. DCI-P3 coverage in my testing was around the 89% mark, so it does provide a wider than sRGB gamut, but only to some degree with a bit of weakness in the green area. This led to 64% Rec 2020 coverage, the worst of the 4K monitors I've tested in this chart, so this is one area where the LG 27GN950 is superior with its 95% DCI-P3 coverage and 70% Rec 2020 coverage. I should note here that covering just the sRGB gamut gives you roughly 55% Rec 2020 coverage, so the M28U is indeed still wide gamut despite coming in last place on this chart. Outside of gamut coverage, I was impressed with this monitor's factory calibration. My unit had no appreciable color tint and only slight errors with gamma, giving a great Delta E 2000 average of below 2.0. This minimized inaccuracies in the color tests, which are brought about due to a lack of an sRGB clamp enabled by default. There is a slight amount of oversaturation out of the box, but due to the limited amount of wide gamut we are getting, it's not too noticeable, so the Delta E averages here aren't that bad. Factory calibration compared to other monitors is great. In color checker, the M28U is the best of the monitors that don't use sRGB clamps by default, and for grayscale it's in the upper group overall, so Gigabyte have clearly put some work into nicely calibrating the display from the factory. Even better is the sRGB mode, which is included and does work as advertised to emulate the sRGB gamut. This reduces Delta E errors in our color tests, leading to great results even for Delta E ITP. A result under 4.0 in that metric for an uncalibrated display is excellent. Grayscale performance was also outstanding, among the best I've seen from a factory calibrated sRGB mode, reducing the minor inaccuracies I saw from the default mode. The only issues I had with the sRGB mode were locking down some of the features. Brightness is unlocked, but white balance controls are unnecessarily locked. It would still be nice to have fine control, just in case the factory calibration isn't as good as what I've shown here, and it can vary from unit to unit. You also can't change the overdrive mode, which is really stupid as it's locked to Smart OD for some bizarre reason. There were 3 great overdrive modes they could have locked people to, but they chose one of the bad ones. Doesn't make a lot of sense. This feature should be unlocked. From here, there are very few tweaks you can make to further improve performance. Even a factory calibration only gives a minor performance uplift for sRGB usage. However, for wide gamut work, you still might want to consider calibration, as these are the results that I was able to achieve. Patreon Floatplane members can download the ICC profile I created. Basically, the monitor is okay for wide gamut work, but it's missing that top 10% of DCI-P3 and doesn't cover Adobe RGB very well at all, so I probably wouldn't get this for color critical work that needs support for those gamuts, though this is of course fine for gaming still. Peak brightness in the SDR mode is pretty mediocre at just 304 nits. It's probably going to be fine for most users, but isn't as good as the majority of gaming displays that I've tested. The display's coding does help cut down on most reflections, but if you want to use this in a super bright environment, it may not be sufficient. And also it's a little bit disappointing given in the HDR mode it can do over 400 nits, so I'm not quite sure why the SDR mode is limited to just 300 nits. However, minimum brightness is great at under 40 nits, so it's well suited to darker environments. The M28U has a native contrast ratio just higher than 1000:1, which is average for an IPS monitor and quite similar to what the LG 27GN950 can provide, so the contrast experience is no different to its competitors. This limits how good the display is for gaming in the dark, as blacks aren't particularly black, and relative to VA monitors the contrast level is poor. This is the classic drawback to IPS monitors that so far has not been improved despite large improvements to response time performance in the last few years. Viewing angles are very good, so no complaints about the experience there, and it's a flat panel, which is my preference for this size and aspect ratio of display. Meanwhile, uniformity is pretty good. Didn't have any complaints there. My unit had not much noticeable IPS glow or any other issues like that. So in that regard, it was a bit better than my 27GN950 unit. Before wrapping this one up, quick word on the M28U's HDR performance. HDR isn't advertise heavily with this monitor, and that's because it's only Display HDR 400 certified and lacks proper HDR hardware. It does get some of the way there with 8 edge-lit dimming zones, but doesn't get bright enough for me to class it as a semi-HDR monitor. 8 edge-lit zones is better than 0 edge-lit zones, but in practice the HDR experience is poor and not significantly different to an SDR display using an HDR tone curve with its brightness turned up. Overall, I have to say the Gigabyte M28U is providing a much more impressive level of performance than I was expecting from a cheaper 4K 144Hz option. This is a really compelling monitor in my opinion. There are no major compromises compared to existing, more expensive monitors on the market, so I have no trouble at all recommending this excellent display. Response time performance is most impressive. This monitor is faster than most other 4K monitors that I've tested, including the LG 27GN950, and it does so with a single overdrive mode experience and with full console support through HDMI 2.1. On top of that, it provides backlight strobing and variable refresh rate support simultaneously, improving motion clarity in some instances. This is a very strong showing and indicates the lower cost panel Gigabyte are using here is not compromising on the required speed for today's gaming monitors. Color quality is very good as well, with excellent viewing angles and above average factory calibration, including an excellent sRGB mode from an accuracy standpoint. It doesn't have the widest color gamut or the best contrast ratio or the highest brightness, but all of those areas are good enough for gaming and none are massive weaknesses. A lot of people want to buy IPS gaming monitors for that balance between speed and colors, and I think that balance is being struck nicely with the M28U. Even the design and build quality is perfectly fine for this price point with height adjustability and the inclusion of a KVM switch like Gigabyte's other M series monitors. It's really hard to point to any massive weaknesses here because, well, there really aren't any. Yeah, I guess sure it would have been nice to have proper HDR support, but that would have been an insane expectation at this sort of price point. Now that I've tested the Gigabyte M28U, I really don't see a reason to buy a 4K 144Hz monitor that doesn't use this 28-inch panel. I mean, the M28U is only $600 and it's better than the LG 27GN950 in my opinion, especially because it includes HDMI 2.1. Why would you spend $200 more on an inferior product? And yes, there is a new model, the 27GP 950, that does bring support for HDMI 2.1, but it's even more expensive at $900. Without significantly better performance, which I'm not expecting LG to provide with that sort of refresh of a monitor, it's a very tough sell and highlights the outstanding value that Gigabyte are offering. This is a big shift forward for the 4K gaming market as we edge closer to more mainstream affordability for these panels. It also presents interesting comparisons like, would you get this or spend $100 more on a Samsung Odyssey G7? Certainly pros and cons to each monitor, whereas previously I felt that 4K 144Hz was maybe a bit too expensive relative to new 1440p 240Hz options. The only competition I see to the M28U for now in the 4K space are other monitors that use this same panel, and I'm hoping to check out a few of those soon. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Gigabyte M28U. If you're interested in this monitor, we do have links to it in the description below. Down there, you'll also find our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. If you sign up to those, you get access to things like our ICC profiles that we generate during the calibration process. We've got our Discord community if you want to chat about monitors and all sorts of other PC-related hardware stuff in there. Monthly live streams, behind-the-scenes videos, all sorts of great stuff. So check all of that out. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.